Chaos is a fundamental fact of existence, as the laws of physics state that entropy, also known as disorder, will always increase. The law of entropy doesn't only apply to subatomic particles, but to every facet of existence, including civilization itself, since the structure of highly organized human societies are always at risk of breaking down. History shows us that many civilizations collapsed after a single catastrophic event, including floods, volcanic eruptions, and disease epidemics. Thus, civilization is in a constant struggle to maintain order and battle against the chaotic forces of nature. As Krishna states in the Bhagavad Gita, "He who fails to keep turning the wheel thus set in motion has damaged the working of the world and has wasted his life." After a catastrophe, it is easy to give up hope and regress to a more primitive state of life, but in order to preserve civilization, it is necessary to resist the urge to be acquiescent. This battle does not only take place in the outer world, but in the internal realm of the psyche, as the ego battles against the chaotic unconscious. The ego attempts to be the supreme master of the psyche, but this supremacy is always threatened by the unconscious, as our primal animalistic nature may get in the way of our spiritual ambitions. The development of the conscious system, having as its center an ego, which breaks away from the despotic rule of the unconscious, is prefigured in the hero myth. The continuous functioning of civilization depends upon people who have strong egos, rather than those whose behavior is determined by unconscious instinct, whose primal nature threatens to burst forth and disrupt the moral foundations of consciousness. The struggle against chaos, which manifests in the unconscious, is captured mythologically as the fight against the dragon. The dragon is a complex symbol, which possesses a potent psychological meaning, which extends both inwards into the human soul and outwards into the natural world. And understanding the dragon symbol will enable us to see why so many early cultures glorified the dragon fight myth. Dragons and dragon-like creatures appear everywhere in early mythology, and according to depth psychology, the reason they are so common is due to the fact that the foundational structure of the unconscious is shared by all people. In general, these magnificent creatures represent primordial chaos and destruction. These entities are often snake-like and reptilian, but many other mythical monsters belong in this category of symbols, as they represent the deep, unconscious, reptilian animality which we possess in the archaic, preformed layers of the human psyche. This unconscious beast-like nature exists in all of us, and the story of the hero is a story of attempting to gain mastery over the reptile within. The ego often encounters great resistance when attempting to assert its higher spiritual values, and this resistance can come in the form of laziness, fear, or thinking with our emotions rather than with our reason. However, overcoming our unconscious instincts and bad habits will reap great rewards, for which reason the hero gains a treasure once the dragon is defeated. It is evident that the hero's journey brings with it a new spiritual status, a new knowledge, and an alteration of consciousness. In the earliest myths, dragons first appear in the form of primordial serpents. Snake-like imagery in particular is used to create an aversion to the unconscious, since primates seem to have a natural fear of snakes, which humans appear to have archetypally retained. It also elevates the hero as one who bravely challenges and overcomes a great danger, while at the same time symbolically depicting the difficulty one faces, while attempting to attain supremacy over the psyche. This is why we have stories like the fight between Zeus and Typhon. In Greek mythology, Typhon was an enormous snake-like being, who was supposedly so destructive that he reduced mountains to rubble. With his overwhelming power, he threatened to overthrow the Greek gods. Zeus, representing the ego, fights Typhon for mastery over the cosmos, and defeats him by striking him down with lightning bolts. This story is symbolic of the power struggle which takes place in the psyche, and is mythologically represented as the battle between a familiar hero and an evil reptilian entity who represents chaos. The fact that these serpentine beasts represent the unconscious is apparent from their symbolism. Many of them reside in the depths of caves beneath the earth, or deep underwater, just as the unconscious manifests from the deep and hidden layers of the mind. In Norse mythology, the world serpent Jormungandr inhabited the ocean, and was so large that he wrapped around the earth and could bite his own tail. This Ouroboros imagery connects the serpent to a sense of the ancient and primordial, as the age before the dawn of consciousness. Water serpents are very common in early mythology, as water is a symbol of the unknown. These primordial serpents are often defeated by gods who represent the spiritual realm of heaven. For instance, in Babylonian mythology, the deadly sea serpent Tiamat brings forth primordial chaos, and is slain by the storm god Marduk. The world serpent Jormungandr is also defeated by a storm god, in this case Thor. Every early culture seems to possess some form of this myth. In ancient Egypt, the chaos serpent Apep battles against the god of the sun, Ra. Each day, Ra descends down into the sunset to battle against Apep, rising each morning to signal his triumph in the fight, just as we also descend into the unconscious whenever we sleep. We see similar myths in the battle between Yahweh and Leviathan, and in the Hindu myth of Indra the storm god fighting against the serpent Vitra. These myths also have parallels in the Far East, such as the Japanese tale of the storm god Susanoo fighting against the sea snake Orochi, or of Jianglu being defeated by Yu the Great. All of these serpents represented some form of chaotic destruction, in the form of droughts, hurricanes, floods, or even disease. For this reason, Neumann identifies the symbol of the dragon as ultimately representing the Great Mother. This doesn't mean the personal mother, but rather Mother Nature, whose destructive capacity is likened to being absorbed by the passive and instinctual nature of the mother archetype. The hero's fight is always concerned with the threat to the spiritual masculine principle from the Ouroboros dragon, and with the danger of being swallowed by the maternal unconscious. Just as we fight against the forces of nature in the physical world, so too do we fight against the forces of nature in the spiritual world of the psyche, as both challenge the supremacy of consciousness. This is even prefigured in myths. For instance, Jianglu, the Chinese water serpent we discussed before, was a bringer of great floods and destruction, but his defeat by Yu the Great, also known as Yu the Engineer, is really an allegory about how Yu built an extensive flood prevention system, thereby gaining mastery of nature. Such mastery is a consequence of consciousness, which allows us to manipulate nature for our benefit. But just as we are led towards the mastery of nature outside, so too must we master our own inner nature. The more we go against our unconscious nature, the more the reptilian psyche will attempt to assert its dominance, in an attempt to regain control of the psyche, and hence, this internal battle is also represented by an external battle against the forces of chaos. The unconscious forces of this now obsolete psychic stage thereupon deploy themselves against the ego hero as fearsome monsters and dragons, demons and unclean spirits, who threaten to swallow him up again. The terrible mother, the all-inclusive symbol of this devouring aspect of the unconscious, is therefore the great mother of all monsters. All dangerous effects and impulses, all the evils which come up from the unconscious and overwhelm the ego with their dynamism, are her progeny. Dragons are symbols of the primordial power which emerges from the unconscious. Many myths, particularly in the West, present this force as an evil which must be conquered and vanished. This is likely because of the dark tendencies which often arise from the unconscious mind. The successful masculinization of the ego finds expression in its combativeness and readiness to expose itself to the danger which the dragon symbolizes. The ego's identification with masculine consciousness produces the psychic cleavage, which drives it into opposing the dragon of the unconscious. Dragons, however, are fearsome, and so this battle is not at all decisive. Just as Zeus initially loses the fight against Typhon, so too do we often lose the fight against our internal dragons. The overwhelming power of the unconscious means that we must perpetually fight against the reptilian mind if we wish to be the true ruler of the psyche. This symbol, which arises naturally from the mind, is also a profound metaphor about conquering our fears. Consciousness cannot grow unless it dares to take the journey into the unknown, instead of choosing what is safe and familiar. Thus, the growth of consciousness requires courage, and there is no better symbol of courage than the hero who faces the terrifying dragon. The definiteness and directedness of the conscious mind, writes Jung, are extremely important acquisitions, which humanity has bought at a very heavy sacrifice, and which in turn have rendered humanity the highest service. Without them, science, technology, and civilization would be impossible, for they all presuppose the reliable continuity and directedness of the conscious process. However, not all myths take such an aggressive stance against the dragon. Since the dragon is an archetype which represents the unconscious, fighting against the dragon represents ego inflation, or the process of the ego becoming larger and larger, something which is necessary for the evolution of consciousness. However, this ignores the fundamental fact that the dragon is a part of ourselves, and it might be better to tame this aspect rather than outright destroying it. In fact, the treasure which the hero receives as his reward for killing the dragon, such as the gold guarded by the dragon Fafnir, may be a better relationship to the unconscious. The myth of Marduk fighting against the dragon Mishushu ends with the dragon becoming a servant of the storm god. Similarly, many snake-like beings in mythology are involved in the creation of the world, and so while they are associated with the primordial unconscious, they aren't outright evil. The unconscious has a light and dark aspect, and both must be taken into account. Chinese dragons are also immensely powerful, and are associated with rain, oceans, and rivers. Unlike in the West, they are depicted as legendary sources of divine energy. Many emperors even claim to have descended from these powerful beasts. Different ideas about the dragon in different civilizations likely represent differences in cultural attitudes and values. However, the image of the fight against the dragon, in the attempt to subdue its primordial power, remains highly relevant for the development of consciousness, as we all sooner or later struggle against the chaotic animal within. Subduing this chaos enables the ego to be the supreme master of the psyche. But just as the dragon within emerges from the depths of the psyche to challenge the ego, another force, this time from the spiritual realms of heaven, may also come to challenge the ego. Just as the ego must battle against the forces of chaos, it must also fight against the oppressive force of excessive order. This idea is prefigured in the motif of the killing of the father, and we will examine this idea in Part 7.